Before Bugsy Siegel and the Mafia turned Las Vegas into a gambling empire, one man ruled the city's underworld. This is the story of Jim Ferguson, the first mobster in Las Vegas, a bootlegger, enforcer, and criminal mastermind who built a network of corruption that stretched from Nevada to California and Utah. Discover how Ferguson partnered with Mayor Fred Hesse and Police Chief Spud to control gambling, bootlegging, and prostitution in the 1920s. From Block 16's red light district to federal raids, political scandals, and murder trials, this video uncovers the rise and fall of a forgotten crime boss who laid the foundation for the Las Vegas we know today. If you love true crime, organized crime history, or the early days of Las Vegas, this is a story you won't want to miss. If you enjoy our videos, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share your thoughts about today's topic in the comments. It really helps the channel grow. Let's begin. Little is known about the early years of Jim Ferguson, the man who would become known as Las Vegas's first mobster. Most of what history remembers about him begins after his arrival in Nevada. When he was arrested later in life, Ferguson told prison guards he had been born on January 9, 1893 in Memphis, Tennessee. At that time, Memphis was a city shaped by both post-Civil War poverty and growing organized vice, an environment that may have influenced his later career in bootlegging and racketeering. By the time authorities began taking note of him in the 1920s, Ferguson bore 2 scars from bullet wounds across his stomach, signs of a violent past. When asked about his profession, he deflected suspicion by claiming, "I am a farmer." It was a modest lie from a man who would soon control one of the most profitable illegal enterprises in early Nevada. Virtually nothing is documented about Ferguson's first 30 years, but when he finally appeared in public records, he already carried the aura of a hardened criminal, experienced, cunning, and unafraid of violence. In 1924, at age 31, Ferguson surfaced in Ely, Nevada, a mining town that had grown quickly around its vast copper deposits. During the 1920s, much of the United States was under the restrictions of prohibition, with the manufacture and sale of alcohol outlawed nationwide. Gambling and prostitution were also illegal in most states, including Nevada. Yet, in practice, many communities in Nevada treated these laws with flexibility. Ely was among those that were wide open. Its population made up mostly of single laborers working long hours in the mines and spending freely afterward. Like Las Vegas at the time, it was a young town, officially incorporated only in 1907. Despite the outward opportunities, Ferguson found that Ely already had an established system of vice. The city's political leaders and underworld figures had struck their own deals, leaving little room for outsiders to move in. Every brothel, saloon, and gambling den was already tied to local power brokers. For a newcomer like Ferguson, whose livelihood depended on taking control of vice operations, there was no opening to seize. It was in Ely's restricted district, the local red light area, that Ferguson met Vera Magness, a woman who worked in prostitution and harbored ambitions of running her own brothel. The two shared an interest in profit and independence. Before long, they became partners, she as the business face and he as the enforcer. Their relationship grew quickly. Though never officially married, Vera was soon known publicly as Mrs. Ferguson. Together, they decided to leave Ely and seek a city with more potential. That city was Las Vegas, a small but rapidly developing community tied to the railroad, with a population of around 2,300 people. By late 1924, Jim and Vera Ferguson packed up and headed south, setting their sights on a new town where gambling, bootlegging, and prostitution all flourished just beneath the surface of the law. Las Vegas was ready for someone bold enough to organize its vices, and Jim Ferguson was ready to claim that role. When Jim Ferguson and Vera Magness arrived in Las Vegas in late 1924, the town was still small and rough around the edges. With a population of about 2,300, it was little more than a dusty stop along the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad. But beneath its modest surface, Las Vegas had already gained a reputation as a place where nearly any vice could be found. Gambling, bootlegging, and prostitution all thrived in the shadows. Officially, these activities were illegal. Prohibition had outlawed alcohol nationwide, and local ordinances banned open gambling and prostitution. Yet in practice, enforcement was inconsistent at best. Most locals viewed vice as a necessary part of economic life. The city's police cared less about stamping it out and more about keeping crime under control. At the time, the red light district known as Block 16 was the heart of this underground economy. It was one of only 2 city blocks where saloons were allowed to sell alcohol when the railroad first sold its land back in 1905. Over the years, that rule had broken down, and those same saloons had expanded into full-fledged brothels and gambling halls. While other Nevada towns had well-established crime bosses, Las Vegas was still open territory, small enough for one ambitious man to take control, but large enough to turn illegal business into real power. Ferguson immediately saw the opportunity. In early 1925, Las Vegas was under intense scrutiny for its reputation as a lawless frontier town. The Clark County Grand Jury convened that year to investigate what it described as the city's very unsatisfactory moral condition. Gambling, prostitution, and especially bootlegging were rampant, and few officials seemed eager to enforce the law. On February 5, 1925, the Grand Jury released its official report. It sharply criticized both the sheriff's office and the Las Vegas City Police, condemning what it called the almost total non-enforcement of prohibition laws. The report accused local officers of allowing illegal liquor sales to flourish unchecked and urged a concerted effort to clean up the city's vices. The jury also attacked gambling, calling it one of the most pernicious vices, demoralizing in its effect and which brings into a community an undesirable element. Newspapers such as the Las Vegas Age supported the jury's findings, insisting that local authorities must finally act to restore morality and order. But to Jim Ferguson, who had only recently arrived in town, the report revealed something else: a system riddled with weakness. He recognized that the moral crusade was more about appearances than real reform. The divisions among local officials, combined with lax enforcement, created the perfect environment for someone like him to exploit the city's vices and consolidate power. The timing of the grand jury's report couldn't have been more politically charged. Las Vegas was preparing for its 1925 municipal election, which would decide the mayor and 4 city commissioners. With morality now dominating public debate, every candidate was forced to take a stand on vice and enforcement. The incumbent mayor, William German, ran on a promise to halt bootlegging and raise the city's moral standards. He called Las Vegas's brothels and saloons a brazen temptation to the susceptible and urged voters to elect men with the courage and backbone to clean up the city. His opponent, Fred Hesse, struck a more moderate tone. He agreed that the city needed reform, but insisted that enforcement should be carried out with sanity as well as decency. That phrase appealed to voters who benefited from vice businesses or saw them as part of the city's economy. The race was close. Out of 941 votes cast, Hesse defeated German by only 38 votes. Once in office, the new mayor appointed 4 commissioners to oversee the city's key departments: police, streets, utilities, and finances. The mayor held the power to assign each role personally, giving Hesse significant control over the city's internal workings. This shift in leadership marked the start of a new era of quiet corruption. Under Hesse's administration, the city tolerated bootlegging and prostitution as long as they operated discreetly and paid their dues. Behind the scenes, Jim Ferguson was already building relationships with the right officials, setting the stage for his rise as the first organized crime boss in Las Vegas. By mid-1925, Jim Ferguson had become a rising power in the Las Vegas underworld. His companion, Vera Magness, had opened her own brothel in the red light district, Block 16, while he positioned himself as a broker between bootleggers, prostitutes, and local officials. But to truly rule Las Vegas's vice economy, Ferguson had to confront the man who already did: Al James. For nearly 2 decades, Al James had been the undisputed boss of the city's illicit trade. He owned and operated the Arizona Club, the largest and most profitable saloon and gambling hall in Las Vegas, right in the center of Block 16. His empire dated back to the early years of the town, when the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad auctioned off its land in 1905. Under the original deeds, alcohol sales were permitted only in Blocks 16 and 17. That legal quirk had concentrated nearly all of Las Vegas's liquor and prostitution businesses in those 2 blocks, and James had controlled them ever since. By the mid-1920s, however, times were changing. Prohibition had pushed liquor sales underground, and competition among bootleggers was growing. James's grip on the district had weakened. The city's moral reform campaign had disrupted his network, and his alliances in local government were fraying. Ferguson saw his opening. Rumors began to circulate in May 1925 that trouble was brewing in the underworld, as the local papers called it. Whispers of a shake-up for control of Block 16 spread quickly through saloons and brothels. That summer, Ferguson decided to act. On the night of July 21st, 1925, the simmering rivalry exploded into open violence inside the Arizona Club. According to the Clark County Review, fires of a feud which have been smoldering for some time burst forth into lurid flames. Ferguson and his men stormed the saloon, turning the night into chaos. The Las Vegas Age described it as a wild night in which the clan of one James Ferguson, a man who appears to have ambitions to be king of the Tenderloin, fought openly for control. The Arizona Club, long considered off-limits to outsiders, had been violated in front of the entire city. Newspapers immediately recognized the significance. Ferguson wasn't just causing trouble, he was declaring war for control of Las Vegas's vice district. Police arrived quickly and arrested Ferguson, charging him with assault with a deadly weapon with intent to commit bodily injury. Among those detained were 3 women described by the press as denizens of the district. The case drew heavy attention from both of Las Vegas's newspapers, which treated the brawl as evidence that the city's underworld was erupting into open warfare. Despite his growing influence, Ferguson couldn't avoid conviction. He hired the town's best lawyer, Artemus W. Ham, to defend him, but the evidence and the public pressure was too strong. The court found him guilty and he was sentenced to 4 months in the county jail. Yet even behind bars, Ferguson's reach extended across the city. Vera Magness kept their brothel running and continued to collect money from allied businesses, while Ferguson's men enforced his will on the streets. During his short sentence, Al James's power collapsed. Though James still owned the Arizona Club, Ferguson's crew effectively ran it. When Ferguson walked free in early 1926, he had achieved what few thought possible. He had overthrown a 20-year establishment and made himself the undisputed ruler of Block 16. The local press began referring to him by a new title, King of the Tenderloin. When Jim Ferguson stepped out of jail in early 1926, he was no longer just a street enforcer, he was the man who ran Las Vegas's vice district. But to keep that power, he needed protection from the law. Luckily for him, the city's leadership was open to negotiation. That same year, Mayor Fred Hesse remained in office after his 1925 victory, and the city commission appointed Robert Ernest "Spud" Lake as the new city marshal, a position effectively serving as chief of police. Both men had deep local roots. Lake came from a pioneer family that had been in Las Vegas since 1904, and both saw the benefit of a manageable vice economy rather than all-out enforcement. Ferguson quietly struck a mutual arrangement with Hesse and Lake. Instead of constant raids and arrests, the police would tolerate his operations in exchange for regular payments. Ferguson would keep order in the city's underworld, and officials would keep federal agents at bay. This understanding effectively turned the city's law enforcement into a revenue-collecting arm for the underworld, blurring the line between government and organized crime. Ferguson's system operated on two levels, one official and one unofficial. The official arrangement was a set of routine fines paid to the city by bootleggers and saloon owners. These fines were smaller than federal penalties, and in exchange the city agreed not to shut down any of Ferguson's stills, distributors, or brothels. On paper, it looked like a civic compromise, a minor penalty for maintaining public order. In reality, it was a shield for organized crime. The unofficial system, however, was pure extortion. Ferguson charged every bootlegger in town a monthly protection fee. In return, they could operate freely without harassment, but only if they followed his rules. Those who refused to pay would face police raids, heavier fines, or worse. Ferguson even required that many local bootleggers buy their liquor directly from his own stills. This vertical setup, from production to distribution to retail, made him the central figure in Las Vegas's illegal liquor trade. His product flowed to saloons, gambling halls, and private buyers throughout the city, often disguised as medicinal whiskey. To keep his empire running smoothly, Ferguson made sure that the vice businesses in Block 16 avoided any public incidents that might draw attention. As long as the brothels and bars didn't cause disturbances, the city leadership pretended not to see what was happening. By 1926 and 1927, Ferguson's influence extended far beyond Las Vegas. He built contacts with bootleggers and smugglers across Nevada, California, and Utah, turning his local racket into a regional network. Federal agents later reported that Ferguson bragged about supplying liquor to mobsters in Southern California, claiming that his whiskey reached Los Angeles on a regular basis. At home, his control was nearly absolute. Las Vegas newspapers described him as having the city tied up tighter than ever before. He decided who could sell alcohol, who could open a brothel, and who could gamble without interference. By 1928, with Mayor Hesse seeking re-election and Police Chief Lake still in office, Ferguson's grip on Las Vegas seemed unbreakable. He had transformed the small desert town's vices into a profitable, organized system of corruption, one that fed the city treasury, enriched its officials, and cemented his status as the first true mob boss in Las Vegas. The year 1928 began with everything seemingly under Jim Ferguson's control. He ruled Las Vegas's underworld through fear, money, and influence. His wife, Vera Magness, managed brothels in Block 16, and his bootlegging network stretched across the region. The city's leadership, Mayor Fred Hesse, Police Chief Robert Spud Lake, and Police Commissioner Roy Neagle had become silent partners in Ferguson's operations, but their fragile alliance was about to break. On the evening of February 6, 1928, federal prohibition enforcement agents struck Las Vegas in one of the largest raids the city had ever seen. Acting on weeks of undercover surveillance, they launched simultaneous attacks across Ferguson's territory, hitting every major speakeasy, saloon, and liquor warehouse. At around 5 p.m., agents swarmed Las Vegas's booze halls, catching Ferguson's men completely off guard. They seized thousands of gallons of illegal whiskey, shut down more than a dozen establishments, and arrested many of Ferguson's associates. Even the Arizona Club, the crown jewel of Ferguson's empire and located directly across from his home, was raided. Federal agents later reported that buying alcohol in Las Vegas had been as easy as ordering a soda, and that they had been able to purchase liquor at nearly every bar in town. For 2 years, the federal government had tolerated local corruption, but now, with Las Vegas's bootlegging problem growing too visible, Washington sent a message. In a single evening, Ferguson's operation was nearly dismantled. The arrest included several of his trusted bootleggers and enforcers, and the seizures wiped out much of his stock. For the first time since his rise to power, Ferguson faced a threat he couldn't bribe or intimidate away. Mayor Fred Hesse immediately went into crisis mode. The federal raid had exposed how deeply his administration was tied to Ferguson's network, and he moved quickly to protect both his office and his allies. Working through the night and into the next day, Hesse tried to negotiate with federal officials. His proposal was bold. If the government would transfer all cases to the city court, he promised the city would cover the full cost of the federal raid. The plan would allow Hesse to reduce the charges from federal felonies to local misdemeanors, turning what could have been prison sentences into simple fines. After tense discussions, the federal government agreed. Within 48 hours, a special hearing was held in Las Vegas City Court. What followed was a spectacle of corruption disguised as justice. As one newspaper later put it, $100 bills stumbled over each other in their haste to get into the city treasury. By nightfall on February 8, 1928, the city had collected $4,800 in fines, roughly $4,150, after reimbursing the federal government for its costs. Virtually all of that money came from Ferguson's organization, funneled through intermediaries to keep his men out of federal prison. The quick payouts bought Ferguson some breathing room. Within days, several of his liquor dens quietly reopened. But the damage had been done. The raid had drawn national attention, and Las Vegas was now on the radar of federal prohibition agents. Ferguson's empire was still standing, but the foundation had cracked, and his political protection was no longer guaranteed. The illusion of control that had defined Las Vegas for 3 years was starting to collapse. Just months after the 1928 federal raids, Las Vegas was shaken by a tragedy that exposed the corruption between its city leaders and Jim Ferguson's criminal empire. On the evening of June 16, 1928, 8-year-old Sheridan Bradshaw, the son of a local bootlegger, was shot and killed by a police officer during a reckless pursuit. The boy's father, Charles Bradshaw, had once been one of Ferguson's own bootleggers, paying $50 a month in protection fees to operate his small liquor business safely. But when Bradshaw refused to continue paying, Ferguson allegedly ordered local police, who were in his pocket, to pressure him through harassment and arrests. That June night, Police Chief Robert Spud Lake, his wife, and a recently deputized special officer, Henry Diedrich, spotted Bradshaw's car driving through town. Knowing Bradshaw's reputation as a bootlegger, Lake turned his vehicle around and began chasing him down Charleston Boulevard. As the cars crossed the railroad tracks and turned onto Main Street, Lake ordered Diedrich to fire at Bradshaw's tires to force him to stop. Diedrich fired several rounds. One bullet shattered the rear window of Bradshaw's car, striking 8-year-old Sheridan Bradshaw in the head. The child was rushed to the hospital but died shortly after midnight. The community was horrified. A boy had been killed over what amounted to a misdemeanor liquor violation, and everyone knew that the local police and city hall were entangled with Ferguson's racket. The shooting became a symbol of how far corruption had gone. In the hours following the shooting, authorities arrested Henry Diedrich and placed him in jail, though he was kept in relative comfort, even provided a nurse due to poor health. A coroner's inquest was quickly convened that same weekend, with jurors hastily assembled late Sunday night. At 11:05 p.m., the jury issued its ruling. Sheridan Bradshaw had died from a gunshot wound fired accidentally by Officer Diedrich. Despite the suspicious speed of the investigation, Chief Lake was also taken into custody, and both men were arraigned just before midnight. Bail was set at $5,000 each, and by 1 a.m., they were released, bonded out by Mayor Fred Hesse and County Commissioner James Cashman. Public outrage grew. Residents accused the city of protecting its own, and within 2 days, District Attorney Harley Harmon announced his intention to file first-degree murder charges against both Lake and Diedrich. When questioned, Harmon said the case represented one of the most important that's ever faced our community, adding that a serious state of affairs exists in Las Vegas, of which this tragedy is but a climax. By June 18th, Chief Lake resigned, saying he wanted to relieve the city administration of any possible embarrassment. The district attorney's charges were soon reduced by a judge who ruled that the evidence fit involuntary manslaughter, not murder. Still, the city's leadership, Mayor Hesse, Commissioner Neagle, and others, were now under intense scrutiny. Their close ties to Ferguson, their financial dealings with bootleggers, and their role in the boy's death became impossible to ignore. The trial of Lake and Dedrick began in September 1928 and drew intense attention across Nevada. Witnesses included Charles Bradshaw, who testified about the shooting and about Ferguson's extortion racket. He admitted under oath that for 5 months he had paid Ferguson $50 a month for protection, and that as long as he did, local police officers never molested Ferguson. But once he stopped paying, Bradshaw said, he was arrested 3 times in rapid succession. During questioning, Lake admitted that he ordered Dedrick to fire even though he knew there were women and children in the car. When asked whether he had a warrant to arrest Bradshaw, he conceded that he did not. The defense argued that Bradshaw was at fault for running from the police and for bringing his family along while transporting bootleg liquor. When the jury deliberated, their verdict reflected that sentiment. After just 30 minutes, they returned not guilty verdicts for both defendants. The Las Vegas Review later reported that jurors believed the responsibility was traceable to Bradshaw's own willful disregard for the safety of his wife and children. District Attorney Harmon disagreed publicly, calling the verdict a dangerous precedent. He warned that promiscuous shooting by officers for petty offenses must be discouraged if human life is to be protected. But by then, the damage was done. The killing of Sheridan Bradshaw had laid bare the extent of corruption in Las Vegas. It exposed how city officials, law enforcement, and gangsters like Jim Ferguson worked together to control vice, and how their power came at the cost of innocent lives. The tragedy marked the beginning of the end for Ferguson's empire. Federal agents, now watching closely, began connecting the dots between the mobster, the mayor, and the police. Within weeks, another round of indictments would begin to tear their alliance apart. Exactly 1 month after the death of Sheridan Bradshaw, federal agents returned to Las Vegas, this time with a clear target. Acting on inside information from Charles Bradshaw, who blamed Jim Ferguson and his allies for his son's death, the agents moved against Ferguson himself. At 9 a.m. on July 16, 1928, a team of federal officers armed with a search warrant arrived at Ferguson's home, located just across the street from Block 16. They found him asleep. When the agents searched the house, they discovered a concealed trapdoor leading to the basement, where they uncovered one of the largest caches of illegal liquor ever seized in Las Vegas. Inside were more than 200 gallons of whiskey, along with boxes of bottles and stacks of counterfeit labels marked bonded goods approved by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales. The agents reported that the stockpile was enough to supply the needs of the city for a considerable time. Ferguson was arrested and charged with multiple violations of the Volstead Act, the federal law enforcing prohibition. His bail was set at $10,000, but this time he couldn't afford it. He was sent north to face trial in the federal courthouse in Carson City. On August 4, 1928, Ferguson pleaded guilty to the charges and paid a $500 fine, earning his release from custody. The guilty plea marked the first time Ferguson faced serious federal consequences, but it didn't end his influence. Upon returning to Las Vegas, he found his name still dominating headlines, not for his own crimes, but because the fallout from the Bradshaw killing was leading investigators closer to the city's highest offices. By the end of 1928, the public mood in Las Vegas had shifted. The federal government was no longer willing to look the other way. The combined pressure of the Bradshaw tragedy, Ferguson's arrest, and the open corruption of city officials forced the feds to act again. That winter, Las Vegans celebrated President Calvin Coolidge's December 1928 signing of the Hoover Dam construction bill, which promised an economic boom. But the excitement didn't last long. With the city drawing new attention from outside investors, the U.S. government moved to clean house. In March 1929, the U.S. Marshal arrived in Las Vegas carrying a stack of arrest warrants. This time, federal agents not only took Jim Ferguson back into custody, but also began building cases against Mayor Fred Hesse, Police Commissioner Roy Neagle, and former police chief Spud Lake. Behind the scenes, a federal grand jury was hearing testimony about Ferguson's bootlegging network, the flow of money to city officials, and the protection racket that had turned law enforcement into a business. Throughout early 1929, the federal grand jury collected evidence of what everyone in Las Vegas already knew. The city government had been operating hand in hand with organized crime. Witnesses described how bootleggers paid monthly fines directly to City Hall, how police selectively enforced laws, and how Ferguson acted as the middleman between the underworld and the authorities. By spring, indictments began rolling out. The federal government charged 20 people in total, a mix of officials, bootleggers, and enforcers, with conspiracy to violate national liquor laws. Some defendants quickly pleaded guilty and paid fines, but the three central figures, Mayor Fred Hesse, Commissioner Roy Neagle, and former police chief Robert "Spud" Lake, refused to admit wrongdoing. They each posted bail and prepared to fight the charges in court. Meanwhile, Ferguson, once again unable to raise money for bail, was sent back to Carson City to await trial. The man who had once ruled Las Vegas's vice rackets was now sitting in a federal jail cell. But he wasn't alone. For the first time, the full weight of federal law had turned against both the city's political elite and its criminal underworld, exposing the corrupt alliance that had built Las Vegas's early foundations. The stage was now set for a series of high-profile trials in 1929 that would determine the fate of Las Vegas's first mob boss and the officials who had helped him rule. By June 1929, the story that had been building for years finally reached its peak. Jim Ferguson, the self-proclaimed king of the Tenderloin, stood trial in federal court on charges of bootlegging and conspiracy to violate national liquor laws. This time, the protection he once enjoyed from City Hall was gone, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Federal prosecutors presented testimony from two undercover prohibition agents, Harry Drew and Roland Godfrey, who posed as Canadian rum runners. They told the court that Ferguson had personally negotiated with them to sell bonded liquor and bragged about having the finest stills in the country. He claimed to be manufacturing huge quantities of alcohol for the California market and openly mocked the idea that Las Vegans wanted quality alcohol, saying, "They've been pretty well educated to drink my moonshine." The agents also testified that Ferguson admitted to shipping liquor into Los Angeles and running operations throughout Nevada, California, and Utah. The image was clear. Ferguson wasn't a small-town bootlegger. He was the head of a multi-state smuggling and distribution network. When the jury received the case, their deliberation took only 40 minutes. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Federal Judge Frank Norcross delayed sentencing, however, until the connected cases against Las Vegas city officials could be heard. For the first time, both the city's criminal and political leadership were being judged side by side in a single courtroom. Following Ferguson's conviction, the federal government proceeded with the cases against Mayor Fred Hesse, Police Commissioner Roy Neagle, and former police chief Robert "Spud" Lake. Prosecutors claimed that the three officials had conspired with Ferguson, allowing his bootlegging empire to operate freely in exchange for regular payments disguised as city fines. Charles Bradshaw, the bootlegger whose son had been killed the year before, was called as a key witness. He testified that he had personally paid Ferguson $50 a month for protection from January 1927 through June 1928, and that after he stopped paying, Las Vegas police arrested him 3 times. Bradshaw said he even questioned Ferguson about Lake's appointment as police chief and was told, "If Lake wasn't all right, we wouldn't have him." Other witnesses included Las Vegas police officers Joe May and another unnamed officer, both of whom testified that Neagle had ordered them to lay off certain saloons known to sell illegal liquor, including the Green Lantern and several establishments on Block 16. May said that when he tried to execute a search warrant, Neagle arrived first, warning the saloon owners before the raid. Agent Harry Drew returned to the stand, repeating that Ferguson had bragged about controlling the city's police department, claiming he could hire and fire the officers, and even influence election results. Despite the damning testimony, Judge Frank Norcross ultimately ruled that much of the evidence was circumstantial. He noted that while the officials clearly tolerated illegal liquor sales, there wasn't enough proof that they had directly profited from or conspired with Ferguson. He described Hesse's decision to transfer federal cases to city court not as corruption, but as a revenue measure for the city of Las Vegas. On June 26, 1929, the jury returned a directed verdict of acquittal for both Mayor Hesse and Commissioner Neagle, finding the evidence insufficient for conviction. Judge Norcross also dismissed most charges against Spud Lake, though he allowed one conspiracy count to proceed to trial. A separate jury heard that case, and after just 50 minutes of deliberation, Lake too was found not guilty. With the city's political leadership cleared, attention turned back to Jim Ferguson. The U.S. Attorney for Nevada described him in his sentencing report as a habitual criminal, whose associates were bad, and whose activities made him a menace to society. Judge Norcross sentenced Ferguson to 1 year and 1 day in federal prison, with the unusual condition that he could be released early upon paying an additional fine. However, before that could happen, the Justice Department intervened, ruling that federal judges had no authority to issue conditional probation after sentencing. Ferguson ultimately served most of his term, earning a brief reduction for good behavior. On May 17, 1930, he walked out of prison 41 days early, a free man once again. But the Las Vegas he returned to was not the same city he had ruled. His political allies were weakened, his empire had splintered, and new criminal groups were beginning to move in. For the first time since arriving in Nevada, Jim Ferguson was no longer in control, and his fall from power would soon be permanent. When Jim Ferguson returned to Las Vegas in mid-1930, he expected to reclaim the city he had once ruled. But the Las Vegas he stepped back into was no longer the same place he had left behind. The town was growing rapidly, fueled by excitement over the upcoming construction of Hoover Dam, and new faces, both legitimate businessmen and ambitious criminals, had moved in to profit from the boom. In Ferguson's absence, the balance of power in the underworld had completely shifted. The once invincible King of the Tenderloin found that his influence had evaporated. The city's vice operations had fractured, now controlled by multiple small groups rather than one dominant boss. Southern California mobsters had begun making moves into Las Vegas, bringing more organization and money than Ferguson ever had. Local players who had previously worked under him, like the Stocker family, were now strong enough to resist paying protection money. Even the police, once part of Ferguson's network, had changed. The new Clark County Sheriff, Joe Keat, promised to rid the city of undesirables, a thinly veiled reference to Ferguson and his old crew. Though he tried to stay quiet at first, Ferguson couldn't resist the lure of his old life. He still had connections in Block 16, where his wife Vera Magness continued running the Double O brothel, and he kept company with a few loyal gang members who had survived the raids and arrests of the late 1920s. But the underworld had moved on, and soon trouble found him again. On Christmas night, December 25, 1930, violence once again shattered Las Vegas's uneasy calm. At a familiar Ferguson haunt, the Green Lantern, one of the city's old liquor and gambling dens, a brazen armed robbery took place. Witnesses reported seeing Ferguson's blue Cadillac parked outside during the heist, fueling immediate suspicion that the former crime boss had returned to his old ways. 4 days later, headlines declared that Las Vegas underworld was rocked to its very foundations with the arrest of Jim Ferguson, former liquor king and ex-convict. Sheriff Joe Keat, keeping his campaign promise to clean up the city, personally led the arrest. Ferguson and 2 alleged accomplices were charged with orchestrating the robbery. After a preliminary hearing, the judge dismissed the charges against Ferguson due to lack of evidence, though the other 2 suspects were bound over for trial. Just weeks later, however, one of the defendants claimed that Ferguson had indeed helped plan the holdup, and police arrested him again. Once more, the case collapsed in court. Even though he walked free, the damage to Ferguson's reputation was irreversible. The newspapers no longer called him the King of the Underworld. They referred to him as the one-time reputed King of the Las Vegas Underworld. His era of dominance had ended. Sheriff Keat made it clear that Ferguson's presence was no longer welcome in town. "There's no fooling around this proposition," Keat told reporters. "This town is going to be cleared of undesirables pronto, and we're starting today." Not long after, Ferguson was arrested once more, this time for vagrancy after an altercation on Block 16 in which he allegedly threatened 2 men. He paid his fine and walked out again, but this time he knew Las Vegas had finally closed its doors to him. The city he had once built through violence, liquor, and bribes now belonged to others, and for the first time in his life, Jim Ferguson was an outlaw without a territory. After being pushed out of Las Vegas, Jim Ferguson began drifting across the American West, chasing whatever criminal opportunities remained. He was no longer the powerful figure who once dictated the city's vices. Now, he was a fugitive, living on borrowed time. By 1931, he had resurfaced in Utah, where a string of safecrackings and burglaries began to draw police attention. On October 18th, 1931, authorities in Logan City, Utah, arrested Ferguson, who was using the alias Sam B. Harris, along with 2 accomplices. The trio had been caught after breaking into a safe and stealing a car. Charged with auto theft and burglary, Ferguson at first pleaded not guilty, but prosecutors offered him a deal: plead guilty to third-degree burglary and the other charges would be dropped. He accepted. The judge sentenced him to 1 year and 1 day in the Utah State Prison, plus a fine and court costs totaling $1,820.58, a steep penalty for a man whose fortune had long since vanished. Ferguson served his sentence quietly and was released on November 7th, 1932. But rather than starting over, he drifted north to Spokane, Washington, perhaps hoping for a fresh start under another name. Instead, he found only more trouble. In April 1933, Spokane police arrested him again, this time for vagrancy, and he spent another 30 days in jail. The one-time king of the Tenderloin had fallen to the level of a petty offender, a former boss now living from one arrest to the next. Yet even then, Ferguson couldn't leave crime behind. Later that same year, in October 1933, Ferguson's criminal past caught up with him once again. Police in Lund, Utah, accused him of robbing a railroad boxcar, part of a wider investigation into a regional crime wave stretching from southern Utah to Nevada. Newspapers credited law enforcement with breaking up one of the most dangerous gangs of criminals operating in Nevada, and Jim Ferguson was named among them. Federal authorities charged him with robbery, and by December 12, 1933, a federal court found him guilty. 2 days later, Ferguson arrived at the U.S. Penitentiary at McNeil Island, Washington, to begin serving a 3-year, 6-month sentence. McNeil Island, one of the toughest federal prisons of its time, housed a mix of bootleggers, bank robbers, and violent offenders. For Ferguson, it was far from the smoky bars and dim brothels of Las Vegas. The man who once bribed city officials and commanded gunmen was now just another inmate, his influence and money long gone. He served his term without incident, earning time off for good behavior. By 1936, he was released once again, walking free for what would be the final time. When Ferguson emerged from McNeil Island in 1936, the world that had once made him powerful no longer existed. Las Vegas was beginning to reinvent itself as a legitimate entertainment destination, and organized crime was evolving into a far more sophisticated machine, one that no longer needed men like him. He returned briefly to Nevada, where his longtime companion, Vera Magness, still operated the 00 brothel on Block 16. But his release drew attention. The Las Vegas City Commission, worried about his reputation and Magness's operation, moved to revoke her license, accusing her of allowing underage girls to work there. A city commissioner, M.E. Ward, publicly defended them, calling the case a political setup linked to an old feud between Ferguson and Sheriff Joe Keat. But his support wasn't enough. The 00 was ordered to close. Vera reopened later, though her days as a madam were numbered. As for Jim Ferguson, he vanished soon after. There are no reliable records of his activities or death following his 1936 release. Some locals claimed he left Nevada for good, heading north under one of his many aliases. Others believed he was killed quietly, buried somewhere far from the desert city he once ruled. What is known is that Las Vegas never saw him again. The man who brought organized crime to the city simply disappeared into history, leaving behind only newspaper clippings, police records, and the legend of a violent, ambitious outlaw who built the foundations for the criminal empires that would follow. After being acquitted of all federal charges in 1929, Mayor J. Fred Hesse returned to Las Vegas determined to repair his reputation. But the damage was already done. Public trust had eroded, and many residents saw him as the politician who had allowed corruption and bootlegging to thrive under his watch. Within months of his return, he faced a recall election, though he ultimately survived the vote. Disillusioned with politics, Hesse decided not to seek another term. He told reporters he was finished with public life, saying, "I'm through with politics. I'm going to devote all my time to running the new garage." He returned to private business, opening and managing an auto repair shop in the growing downtown district. When Hesse died in 1941 at the age of 67, local newspapers remembered him not as the mayor entangled in scandal, but as a colourful pioneer from the city's early years. Obituaries described him as a man with a picturesque and adventuresome career. In his lifetime, Hesse had gone from city reformer to political survivor, from mayor to businessman. Despite his controversial tenure, he left his mark on Las Vegas. He was remembered for stabilizing the city's finances, improving streets and lighting, and taking the police department from a loose collection of deputies to a permanent headquarters behind what is now Binion's Hotel. The scandals of the Prohibition era were quietly left out of his final tribute. Like Hesse, Roy Neagle, the city's police commissioner during Ferguson's reign, was acquitted of all charges in the 1929 federal conspiracy trials. Though the case had tarnished his reputation, Neagle's calm testimony and lack of direct evidence against him saved his career. After the trial, Neagle chose not to run for re-election and instead focused on his small retail business in Las Vegas. Having served only one term as commissioner, he quietly returned to civilian life, avoiding public office and the attention that came with it. Little else was recorded about Neagle after his withdrawal from politics. He lived out his life as a local businessman, remembered by some as the man who once controlled the Las Vegas Police Department during its most lawless period, but who managed to walk away unscathed when the city's criminal empire collapsed. After his acquittal in both the Bradshaw killing and the federal bootlegging conspiracy, Robert Spud Lake left law enforcement behind for good. By the mid-1930s, he was working in the very industry his old police department had once policed, the casinos. A 1935 postcard shows Lake managing the big wheel game at a Fremont Street casino, likely the Boulder Club, one of the earliest legal gambling establishments in Las Vegas. He handled both security and game operations, becoming a familiar face to the growing wave of tourists drawn to the desert town. In interviews decades later, Lake spoke candidly about the city's early years. In 1943, when asked about Las Vegas's gangsters and hoodlums, he reacted sharply, saying the city never has been a tough town. In a 1978 interview at more than 80 years old, Lake explained the old arrangement between bootleggers and City Hall during Prohibition. "We didn't bother much with it. There was a fine of so much a month. The biggest part of them would come in themselves and pay their fine and go about their business." He even admitted that Jim Ferguson and one of his partners collected the bootleggers' fines and turned the money over to the city. "None of the money went to the police officers," he said. "It all went to the city, which tolerated a business profitable to the city coffers." Robert Spud Lake died in Las Vegas at the age of 87, long after the violent, corrupt days of his youth had faded into legend. Vera Magness, long known in Las Vegas as Mrs. Ferguson, had managed the Double O brothel on Block 16 for more than a decade. Even after Jim Ferguson's imprisonment, she continued running the business, adapting as laws and city politics changed. By 1936, when Ferguson was released from McNeil Island Prison, the city had grown increasingly strict about vice. The Las Vegas City Commission accused Magness of allowing underage girls to work in her establishment and moved to revoke her license. Commissioner M.E. Ward publicly defended her, calling it a frame-up connected to an old feud between Ferguson and Sheriff Joe Keat. But his protest failed, the Double O was officially closed. Magness later reopened briefly, but Block 16's red light era was coming to an end. By 1941, mounting pressure from the US military, which had established a base outside the city, led to a full cleanup of the district. The brothels were permanently shut down, marking the end of an infamous chapter in Las Vegas history. That same year, Vera left the sex trade behind. She eventually married a local taxi driver, and by 1965, in her later years, she was working as a maid at a motel on North First Street. Elderly and largely forgotten, she died quietly, far removed from the chaos of the days when she and Jim Ferguson ruled Las Vegas's underworld. After his release from federal prison in 1936, Jim Ferguson seemed poised to return to Las Vegas. But he never did. The city had changed too much, and it no longer had room for him. For nearly 12 years, Ferguson had been a fixture of Nevada's criminal landscape. He'd run bootlegging rings, bribed mayors, and turned small-town vice into organized profit. But his repeated arrests, imprisonments, and the loss of his old network left him with nowhere to go. There are no confirmed records of Ferguson's life after his 1936 release from McNeil Island. He may have gone north under an alias, or possibly lived quietly somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. His name vanished from police reports, newspapers, and public records altogether. His death, whenever and wherever it occurred, was never recorded in Las Vegas newspapers. The man who had once been labeled a menace to society and ruled as the first mobster in Las Vegas simply disappeared from history, his life ending in mystery, just as it had begun. Ferguson's legacy lived on not through his name but through what he started. His system of bribery, vice, and political cooperation laid the groundwork for the larger criminal empires that would later transform Las Vegas into the gambling capital of the world.